On today's Newsmakers, what's next in Venezuela? That is what we're covering today. We're joined by Gregory Thompson, professor of criminal justice at Cedarville University. He's here to talk all about the Trump administration's bold move to remove Maduro from Venezuelan power. We'll get into what happened and why it matters. With no further ado, here is Gregory Thompson. The situation in Venezuela is capturing international attention, and understandably so. I appreciate you joining me today to break this important story down. Let's start with your reaction when you saw that Maduro had been captured, and when you sort of woke up to that news. What was your first reaction?
Well, my first reaction was, what an incredible job of the American military to pull this off with no U.S. casualties. But more importantly to me as a Christian, I'm thinking of just the incredible joy, because I have friends that work with pastors in Venezuela, and it's been difficult. As you probably know, when Hugo Chavez took over Venezuela, he kicked out all mission organizations. So that was significant, and the pastors there are being salt and light. So, and what I'm reading is significant portion of the country, to include a lot of people who left over the last 25 years, are excited, but it's very uncertain. Obviously, there's a whole discussion of what's going to happen. Is the U.S. handling this right? Do we have a good plan? We don't have a history of having great plans with doing stability operations, but I'm hopeful, and at least there's some level of promise. So I would say I was really excited. Also, I have family. My wife was born and raised in the U.S. Canal Zone. She was actually there when the U.S. invaded Panama. And so I know the joy that she has, and also that many Panamanians have, to be rid of Manuel Noriega. So all of this to say, I know there are issues, of course, but my general sense is I'm excited for maybe a hopeful future for Venezuela, one that's free, particularly free for the free exercise and the spread of the gospel message of Jesus Christ.
Well, and that's the most important thing. You know, when people look at events like this and they don't have a lot of background, the reaction can often be very swift. And now with social media, you immediately saw a lot of people becoming experts on Venezuela. I mean, admittedly, I know very little outside of what I've covered about some of the situations you mentioned. So I'm very careful to go out and say, oh my gosh, you know, this is a horrible thing or an amazing thing, because I didn't know, you know, but kind of going through and looking at it, can you help people understand? Because I think one of the things we're seeing happen immediately, the reaction for among some was, this is a horrible thing. You know, the Trump administration and the president, they're taking over a sovereign country. They're kicking out a president who's duly elected. And we could talk about that in a moment. But what is the situation in Venezuela? Just so people, you hinted at it at the beginning, but so they really understand, because I think the mindset of most Americans is that every country is like America and it's operating like America does. So can you talk about the situation in Venezuela?
Yeah, that's great. And we actually heard Nicolás Maduro in court say, basically, I'm a good guy and, you know, I'm the current leader. So that leads us to the questions that you've asked. So I won't proclaim to be an expert on Venezuela, but I certainly talk to people who have been in the country, and I've talked to them recently. Venezuela, before Hugo Chavez, was a thriving democracy. It was a place where I was talking to one friend, and he said, yeah, people, and particularly pastors in Venezuela, had been told, if you continue to follow this Cuba model, you're going to find yourself in a horrible situation. And they just didn't believe it could happen. And it did. And in our lifetime, it happened. The things that Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro did under their purview and power was they pretty much wrecked the economy. We've seen that's objectively true. The prices, I read in the paper, just for a Thanksgiving meal, Venezuelan style, doubled in the past year. So inflation is beyond rampant. They have a politically corrupt government, which I think we've heard in the news. Many countries have not even do not recognize Nicolás Maduro, to include the U.S. The United Nations assessed that the 2024 election was won by the opposition party candidate. course, Maria Machado could not even run in the election because the court of Venezuela had convicted her of treason. So imagine that from a First Amendment perspective in the US. If you are an opposition candidate running with a different viewpoint and the executive branch can prosecute you for treason. So they lack all First Amendment rights that we enjoy. They also lack Second Amendment rights. If you see a picture of someone with a gun in Venezuela, they've been given guns by the government. So right now it's really volatile because you have, as things go forward, you have the government with guns, the people are not allowed to have guns. And then you have guns being given to kind of like thugs. I've heard that some of these thugs come straight out of the prisons, and they have these groups called colectivos that now I've seen pictures yesterday on like brand new motorcycles riding around, and I guess it's very uncertain because of that. So what has happened is a dismantling. It's what we see with socialism around the world. It's not been effective. It hasn't produced human flourishing around the country, around the world, I should say. And so Venezuela, I heard today 1,000 political opponents that Nicolás Maduro had basically put away or potentially had killed. This is along the same lines of Manuel Noriega, same type of thing. I haven't even talked about the narco trafficking, which is key to why the U.S. is interested, but I can continue talking about
Well, let's talk about that, because I think everyone is looking at this and they're saying, oh, not everyone, but subsets of people, Trump did this because of oil, and oil definitely seems to be a factor. And a lot of people would argue maybe it should be a factor because, they're the biggest oil producer. They're sitting on the most oil out of any other nation in the world, I believe. But let's talk about both of those things. Let's talk about why, from your perspective, and why, from the government's perspective, the Trump administration chose this route.
Well, oil is always going to be a factor, and we have a capitalist economy, and so I won't say that's not a factor. I don't see that as being the main driving force here. I think with President Trump's concerns when he came into office, this is like the perfect storm. I read that this morning. I think that's a good term because illegal immigration was highly coming from Venezuela. And these are great people by all accounts, and my friends that know people coming out of the country, they're leaving because they want to live in a free country. They want to pursue a place where they can live in freedom and democracy, and so they're coming to America, but illegally, of course, and in droves. So that's one issue. The second issue, of course, is we're talking about countries like Iran. Now we're hearing Hezbollah operating in some fashion. Of course, this has been termed as Cubazuela, which now we know of the people dead, 32 were Cubans who were protecting Maduro. And we also have Russia influence and, of course, Chinese influence, which I'll mention in a moment is really important to the U.S. response here. So I think those are big reasons. Also, we have really an authoritarian dictator who's not properly elected and that the United Nations doesn't recognize. One difference between Panama and Venezuela is we invaded Panama pretty shortly after the election when Noriega's person lost. So we were very, very logically and quickly able to reinstall the properly democratically elected president of Panama. Here, the election was in 2024. So I think in some sense, it's hard for the U.S. to articulate, like, we're going to put that person back in power because it was a while ago. So I think that, so then you get into the concern of the narco terrorism coming into the U.S. Now, to be fair, much of the drugs coming in the U.S. are coming from Colombia and Mexico, but there is significant amount of drug flow. Obviously, we've seen the boat strikes coming from Venezuela. And if I may, I can go on the articulable reason under international law, because I have heard, and I think it was in the United Nations, this is illegal for the U.S. to conduct this operation.
Yes,
so I can talk about the administration's
You read my
view on
mind.
that.
You read my mind, because that was going to be my next question, because I think I keep saying everybody, a lot of people I've been looking for, I'm trying to avoid labeling people groups. And so I'm saying a lot of people have been looking for something to say, oh, look, what Trump is doing is, authoritarian, it's whatever. And so on the surface, it becomes easy in a situation like this to say, oh my gosh, he's, doing something that is terrible. But you just detailed a number of things. This is not a country, just so people understand, and this is why people are in the streets, Venezuelans, celebrating, because this is not a country where things are normal the way that we would experience them. This is a country where it sounds like you have fake elections, you have authoritarian rule, you have narco-terrorism, you have a lot of things going on, influences from other nations that, by the way, we've had plenty of tension with. This is a powder keg in a lot of ways. And so I just want to reiterate everything you said, because I think that's important to understanding. But yes, continue on the international front of whether or not this was an acceptable operation.
Yes, thank you. Because I think this is really important. And the administration has a couple good arguments here. I want to first lay out the counter argument, because I think it helps understand the administration's arguments better. The counter argument is that under the UN Charter, Chapter 2, or Article 2, the UN Charter, which the U.S. has ratified, so it is domestic and I would argue international law, the basic rule is that you may not invade the sovereign territorial integrity of a country. And the only exception to that is in Article 51, which is self-defense. So typically drug use or importation of drugs is not at the level of which you can use self-defense, because you can only use self-defense in response to a use of force. And use of force over the years has been defined in the international community really as, like, think of, this is a military word, kinetic, but like bullets flying, basic, things getting destroyed, that type of force. Well, here's the counter argument that I would make, and I think the administration was making with the boat strikes. It seems like now the administration is saying this is just a military-enabled law enforcement operation to take Nicolás Maduro. But I think they also have an argument here about national self-defense. And here's why. We live in a world now. We've fought the war on drugs for a very long time here in our country and failing at it, obviously. But for a very long time, China's rise has developed a strategy called unrestricted warfare. Unrestricted warfare also uses lawfare. That means that when China is advising other countries, they're going to advise them to operate under this use of force, enabling this type of argument every time. My argument for the administration would be, at some point, the nation, when Americans are dying, which I think we can clearly articulate that Americans are dying, obviously at their own hands, because we have addiction in our country and rampant drug use that is creating a market for this. But shouldn't a country be able to defend itself at some point from something like this by force, a reasonable level of force, a discrete amount of force with particularized objectives? So here we have, under U.S. law, designated terrorist organizations, Tren de Aragua, Cartel of the Suns. The indictment of Nicolás Maduro kind of lays this argument out. And then on top of it, the United States is arguing this was a law enforcement operation, which, again, there's argument against that. But the U.S. Actually, former Attorney General Barr wrote a memorandum in 1989 about this being authorized. Now, there's people who argue that, well, maybe that isn't the best argument. But I would argue it is an argument, and so the government has an arguable position that this is lawful. I'll also say that we have precedent because of Manuel Noriega, which this looks, there's differences, but there's striking similarities. And also significantly, the United States has indicted Maduro, and he's got an opportunity to defend himself to whatever issues that he has. And I think his biggest defense is going to be, I'm a head of state and therefore I'm immune from certain things. I think that's going to fail because even if he were head of state, which the U.S. does not recognize, there's certain things as a head of state that is not part of your official duties, and that includes illegal trafficking of narcotics. So that would be, I think, the administration's case that they're making. Right now, I think they're pressing the law enforcement action side of it. And again, it's impossible to have an agreement with a country when the head of state is the person you have issue with to extradite them into the country. So that wasn't really a viable option.
Do you think, is there a world in which this increases tensions with Russia and China and other nations that we already have tension with? Because this seems like a prime nation for everybody, right? For a lot of reasons, to have a foothold on.
Absolutely. I mean, we're looking at Iran right now. Talk about an interesting situation. Iran has really lost significant amount of power in the region. I mean, based on the stealth bomber strikes, the Israeli action, the 12-day war, the dismantling of Hezbollah and Hamas, this is yet another blow to Iran for certain. Yes, is what I would say to your question. Yeah. How that plays out, I don't know. I think the political assessment here was, you think about why wasn't President Trump more interested in Mexico or Colombia? I think he's made a political assessment, and we'll see if it's correct or not, that Venezuela he could change, and we'll find out.
I mean, let's look at, just before we go, because I think this is important, and I'd love to get your take on this. You have action being taken in Nigeria. First, it was rhetorical action. Then it was literal action. It was placing them back on the countries of particular concern list, which should have happened before, but it happened, thank God. It was, and then so you've got Nigeria, you've got Iran, and you have obviously the U.S. involvement in that situation. And now you have Venezuela. It feels like Trump's strategy is, I think back to the Obama years and the critique that Obama got for his quote unquote apology tour and his approach. You juxtapose Obama's approach to this approach. They could not be further from one another, it feels. And it feels like Trump is trying to take on these ideologies and these dangerous ideologies in many ways in these countries and make a statement that America is going to be, some would say the policeman of the world, or, America's going to step up to the responsibility that it has internationally. I don't know if you want to reflect on that at all, but when I look at those three actions, I think, wow, this is very coordinated. It feels like, and intentional.
Well, that's an interesting point, and I guess we'll see how it plays out. I think the administration has said they see these as existential threats to the United States.
Sure.
Obviously, ISIS training camps in Nigeria that were struck, and we have a long history and precedent of doing that, are threats to the United States and Venezuela. The other thing I didn't say about Venezuela that's important is President Trump, unlike Panama, he has been messaging for 6 months to Nicolás Maduro to leave. And I was thinking about some biblical principles I'm going to share with my class today, because we have national security law class here at Cedarville today. And one of them is God raises and deposes kings. God is sovereign. He is just. And God channels the hearts of kings. And there's many scriptures on all of those ideas. And I don't know exactly how God is handling this, of course, but I do know those things to be true. And Nicolás Maduro decided to stay after significant U.S. pressure, in which I actually had predicted this would happen to my students by Christmas. And I was off, but I actually read an article that they had an invasion or a plan for Christmas, but weather wasn't good. So I at least have that to fall back on. This was very predictable. Nicolás Maduro made his own choices for whatever reason. He had options. Assad lives in Russia. And so Nicolás Maduro probably could have made arrangements elsewhere. He decided to stick it out. I just point that out to your question, because I think President Trump his desire is not to. This was not plan A for him.
Yeah, well, no, and I actually love that response. I think it is, they're very different situations, the three, right? Nigeria and Iran and Venezuela, they're very different. It does feel like, America is taking a bigger stand on the world stage than we've seen in the last few years. And for a lot of people, especially when you talk about existential threats, we know that radical Islam is an existential threat. This is not, we've seen what's happened on October 7th to Israel. We've seen going back in our own history to September 11th, 2001. We know what has happened, and we know that plenty of other things have happened in between those events and even after. So these are big moments. It'll be interesting to track this, and I definitely want to have you back as new developments unfold. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah, I'd love it. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's all for today's Newsmakers. Tune in next week for another episode.